The morning sun rose slowly over the dusty town, spilling its light over a house that no longer belonged to the woman who had built her life inside it. The widow stood on the porch where she had once watched her children grow, the same children who now turned their backs and sold her home as though it were nothing more than wooden nails. Her hands trembled as she touched the railing one last time, her wedding ring dull with age and sorrow. In her silence, there was no anger, only the weight of a heartbreak too heavy for words. The people of the town whispered, as they always did. Some pitied her, some judged her, and some simply looked away, unwilling to meet the eyes of a mother betrayed. In the Old West, survival often demanded hardness, but what they saw in that widow was not weakness. It was endurance. She walked down the dirt road carrying nothing but a small bundle of memories and the echo of her late husband's voice telling her to stay strong, even when the world forgot her worth. Far beyond the town, a quiet cowboy rode alone. He had seen too many storms and buried too many dreams beneath the same sun that now glared down upon her. He wasn't the kind of man who spoke much. His silence carried its own history. But when he heard what had happened to the widow, the woman whose kindness had once saved him from hunger he never repaid, he turned his horse without hesitation. Some debts, he believed, could not be measured in coin, only in honor. The road that led him back to town was lined with memories of a past he had tried to leave behind. He remembered the day she had offered him bread when others offered only judgment, and how her laughter had once softened even the coldest days. Now, knowing she had been cast out by her own blood, something inside him hardened. He had lost many things in his life: friends, land, peace, but he refused to lose his humanity. As the sun dipped low, the quiet cowboy rode into town with a small wooden box tied behind his saddle. He said no word, made no announcement, but when the widow looked up from the street, their eyes met, and for the first time in years, hope flickered behind her tears. Inside that box was a single key, a promise, a beginning, and though no one yet understood what it meant, by dawn, everyone in town would know that not all heroes carry guns. Some carry redemption in silence. The town had long forgotten what kindness looked like. It was a place where men measured worth by gold and pride, where a woman's tears dried faster than footprints in the dust. The widow's children had sold her home with quick words and cold hearts, convinced that comfort mattered more than loyalty. They had promised to build her a new place someday, but deep down, she knew that promises were as fragile as the wind that swept through the canyon. Now, she slept beneath the same star she had once admired from her porch, her heart bruised not by time, but by betrayal. The quiet cowboy watched from a distance as she gathered her meager belongings in a tattered cloth. He remembered that porch well, the way light used to pour across its steps, the sound of laughter that spilled from her kitchen when her children were small. He remembered how, years ago, she had given him a meal when no one else would even offer a glance. That day, she had saved more than his hunger. She had restored his faith in humanity. And now, seeing her cast aside by those she loved most, he felt something stir inside him that he had long buried: duty. The cowboy was not a man of words, but his silence was full of meaning. It was the kind of silence that comes from loss, from years of carrying ghosts you cannot name. He knew that speaking comfort would do nothing for her. Words, after all, had already failed her. Her children's words, the town's words, all promises that turned to dust. So instead, he rode quietly, his mind set on something she did not yet know, something that might just restore her spirit. As he rode, the wind carried whispers of judgment through the town. Why does he care? They said. She's old, broken, and forgotten. But the cowboy didn't hear them, or perhaps he did and chose not to answer. He had seen too many people lose their souls trying to please others, too many lives destroyed by pride and greed. He rode not to earn praise, but to make right a wrong that others were too blind to see. That night, when the widow sat by the edge of the road, staring into the dying embers of a small fire, she heard the faint sound of hooves in the distance. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat as the shadow of a rider approached through the dust. He didn't speak. He simply dismounted, took the wooden box from his saddle, and placed it gently beside her. When she opened it, her trembling fingers met the cool touch of iron, a key, a new beginning she had not dared to dream of. The widow stared at the key, as if afraid it might vanish, her heart caught between disbelief and hope. "What is this?" she whispered, though she already sensed the answer. The cowboy said nothing. He simply looked toward the horizon, where the faint outline of an old cabin stood half buried by time. It wasn't much, just a roof for walls and the whisper of life waiting to be reborn. But to her, it was everything. A home not taken by betrayal, but given by kindness. The walk to that cabin felt like a pilgrimage. The widow's steps were slow, every one of them heavy with years of sorrow. Yet beside her, the cowboy walked without hurry, his silence steady as the wind. When they reached the door, he placed her hand upon the lock and nodded once. The key turned with a soft click, and the door creaked open. Dust filled the air, sunlight streaming through broken slats. Yet in that fragile light, she saw something she hadn't felt in years: belonging. Inside, the cabin bore the marks of time. The floorboards were worn, the walls faded, but the scent of cedar lingered, and the fireplace waited like an old friend. The widow's eyes welled with tears as she stepped inside, touching the rough wood as though she were touching the past. "It's not much," the cowboy murmured finally, his voice low and rough, "but it's yours." Those were the only words he spoke, yet they carried more power than any speech. The widow fell to her knees and wept, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of grace. No one had ever done something like this for her, without wanting something in return. In that quiet cabin, she realized that the world still held men who kept their word without speaking it. The cowboy had given her more than a roof. He had given her dignity back, something her own blood had stolen. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the sound of distant church bells through the valley. The cowboy stepped back, tipping his hat before turning toward the trail. The widow called out, her voice trembling with gratitude, but he didn't look back. Some gifts, he believed, were not meant to be repaid. They were meant to remind the world that goodness still lived, even in silence. And though he rode away, she knew she would never again feel alone. The days that followed carried a stillness the widow had not known in years. Each morning, sunlight spilled through the cracks of her new cabin, and though the place was humble, every board and shadow felt like a miracle. She planted small flowers by the window, the same kind her late husband had once loved, and when the wind brushed through them, she swore she could almost hear his voice again. For the first time since the betrayal, she did not feel invisible. The quiet cowboy's gift had not only restored her home, it had restored her purpose. But word travels fast in a small western town. The whispers that once mocked her now shifted into awe and guilt. People spoke of the cowboy who had built a home for a woman forgotten by her own blood. They called it foolish, others called it noble. But deep down, every heart in that town was moved, even if pride kept their mouths shut. And among those whispers, carried by rumor and wind alike, her children heard the story. When the widow's sons returned, they came not out of love, but out of shame disguised as anger. They rode hard through the dusty road, their boots hitting the porch of the new cabin like thunder. "You couldn't stay gone, could you?" one of them sneered. "You had to make us look like villains." Their words were heavy with guilt they refused to admit, and the widow, standing in the doorway of her new home, felt her heart tremble, not from fear, but from the pain of seeing what her children had become. Inside, she saw the reflection of her husband's portrait still hanging by the wall, the same one she had carried through every hardship. His eyes seemed to watch the scene unfold, silent but knowing. "I didn't ask for this," she said softly, her voice steady but sorrowful. "The house, the kindness, it wasn't for shame, it was for mercy." But her words fell like pebbles against stone hearts. The son saw the house, not the meaning behind it. And before the dust settled from their anger, a familiar sound broke the tension, the slow, steady rhythm of hooves approaching once more. The quiet cowboy had returned, his shadow stretching across the ground like a reminder that not all debts are forgotten, and not all battles are fought with guns. The eldest son turned sharply as the cowboy dismounted, his pride clashing against the silence of the man who had defied him without ever speaking a word. "This isn't your fight," the son spat, his voice dripping with the same arrogance his father once carried. But the cowboy's eyes, calm and unyielding, said otherwise. He didn't come to fight. He came to stand, for the woman who had once stood for him when no one else dared. The air grew thick with tension. The younger son, less hardened than his brother, looked at the cowboy with uncertainty. "Why do you care?" he asked, his tone half defiance, half curiosity. The cowboy didn't answer immediately. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small, folded note, and handed it to the widow. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a faded piece of paper that read only one line: "No good deed dies in silence." The word struck harder than any bullet. The widow pressed the paper to her chest, tears filling her eyes. The eldest son, still fuming, stepped forward, his hand twitching near his belt. "You trying to shame us, cowboy?" he growled. But the man said nothing. He simply looked him in the eye, steady, fearless, and silent. And in that silence, the son felt something far worse than shame. He felt truth. The widow stepped between them, her voice rising not with anger, but with strength. "You see this man and call him foolish," she said, "but he's the only one who remembered who we are. He gave me back a home when you took mine away. You call that shame? I call it grace." Her words, though quiet, carried the weight of justice itself. The cowboy tipped his hat, his eyes soft yet unwavering. He turned to leave, but this time, something in the widow's son shifted. Pride was a heavy thing in the West, but not even pride could withstand the kind of truth that silence carried. And as the cowboy walked away, neither of them could find the strength to speak. Because sometimes, silence says everything words cannot. The sun hung low over the plains that evening, casting long, golden shadows across the valley. The cowboy rode slow, his silhouette fading into the horizon, but his presence lingered like an echo the town couldn't forget. Behind him, the widow stood in the doorway of her cabin, clutching the note to her chest, as if it were scripture. The words, "No good deed dies in silence," burned softly in her heart. She had lived long enough to know that in a world where men shouted to be heard, silence was often the loudest form of truth. Her sons, left standing in the dust, felt that truth like a weight pressing against their chests. The eldest clenched his fists, anger still fighting for space against the shame creeping into his bones. He had believed himself justified, believed that selling his mother's home had been necessity, not betrayal. But now, staring at the cabin the cowboy had built with his own hands, he realized what real honor looked like. It was not in wealth or power. It was in sacrifice. The younger son turned away, his throat tight with regret. "He did what we should have done," he whispered, almost to himself. But his brother said nothing. Pride had built walls around his heart, and it would take more than guilt to break them down. Still, for the first time, the silence between them wasn't filled with anger. It was filled with thought. Inside, the widow lit a lantern and placed it by the window. Its glow flickered gently in the night air, a signal not of fear, but of hope. The house that had once been stolen from her had been replaced by something greater, a home born not from blood, but from kindness. The cowboy's act had reminded her of something she had forgotten long ago, that good men still walk the earth, even if they walked quietly. Far beyond town, the cowboy stopped his horse at the edge of a ridge. He turned back once, gazing toward the faint light in the valley below. He didn't need to see her face to know she was safe. The night wind carried her peace to him like a prayer, and for the first time in years, the quiet man allowed himself a faint, tired smile. Days turned into weeks, and the story of the widow and the silent cowboy spread through the nearby towns like wildfire carried by wind. Travelers came to see the cabin, not because it was grand, but because it was sacred, a symbol of redemption carved out of wood, silence, and grace. Men who had once mocked the cowboy's quiet nature now spoke of him with reverence. He had done what no preacher's sermon or lawman's badge ever could. He reminded them of decency. The widow's children could not escape the tale, nor the whispers that followed them. Every time they walked through town, people looked at them differently, not with scorn, but with pity. They had wounded their own mother, and now the whole world knew it. At night, they couldn't sleep, haunted by the image of the man who had given back what they had taken away. Guilt, they discovered, was a heavier burden than poverty. The younger son finally broke one morning, riding out to the old ridge where the cowboy was said to travel. He found him there, repairing a broken fence post near the river. The cowboy looked up but said nothing. The young man dismounted, swallowed hard, and said, "You had no reason to help her. But you did. You gave her more than a home. You gave her name back." The cowboy didn't answer. He simply nodded, his silence steady, his hands still at work. "Why?" the boy pressed. "Why would you care about someone who wasn't your kin?" The cowboy paused, his eyes meeting the young man's for the first time. And though he spoke only a few words, they were enough to stay with the boy forever. Because once, she cared when no one else did. His voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories. The young man felt tears sting his eyes, for the first time understanding the cost of kindness. As the boy rode back to town, he knew something had changed in him. The anger that once ruled his heart had begun to crumble, replaced by something quieter, something stronger. Redemption, he realized, was not earned in words or grand gestures. It was built in silence, one act of decency at a time. The younger son returned to the cabin before sunrise, his eyes weary, but his spirit changed. When his mother opened the door, she saw something in him she hadn't seen in years: remorse. He didn't speak at first. He simply handed her a small satchel filled with coins. "It's not enough," he said, voice trembling, "but it's a start." She looked at him, tears forming, not for the money, but for the humility behind it. She didn't need gold. She only needed her son back. Inside, the quiet hum of the morning filled the room. The widow made coffee the way she always had, the smell drifting through the air like memory itself. For the first time, they sat together without anger or blame between them. "He said you once helped him," her son whispered, still unable to meet her eyes. She nodded slowly. "He was a stranger back then, just a hungry man who needed a meal. I didn't think much of it." Her voice broke into a soft smile. "Funny, isn't it? How one small kindness can come back to save a whole life." Her words settled over him like sunlight after rain. He realized then that the cowboy's silence was not emptiness. It was gratitude made eternal. Every plank in the cabin, every nail driven into its walls, was his way of saying thank you for what could never be repaid. The son bowed his head, ashamed of what pride had made him blind to. "I'll fix what we broke, Ma," he said quietly. "I'll make you proud again." But the eldest son was not ready to listen. When he heard that his brother had gone to the cowboy, he scoffed. "You think saying sorry fixes everything?" he barked. "That man made us look like fools. I won't bow to him." Yet even as he spoke, the words rang hollow in his chest. The town no longer feared him or respected him. The only power he had left was the anger he refused to let go of. That night, as the wind howled across the plains, he stood outside the cabin watching the lantern glow through the window. Inside, his mother and brother laughed softly, their peace a mirror of what he had lost. The sound twisted his pride into something unbearable. He wanted to walk through that door, to join them, but pride is a cruel chain, and he wasn't ready yet to break it. Days passed, and the quiet cowboy returned to the outskirts of town, where the land met the horizon. He never sought recognition. He only wanted to make sure the widow was safe. Each evening, he'd ride by her cabin, unseen, watching the smoke curl gently from the chimney. Her laughter reached him faintly on the wind, and it was enough. He had done what he came to do. The rest, he believed, was not his to fix. But fate has its way of calling the silent back into the noise of the world. One afternoon, as he rode past the town square, he found himself face to face with the eldest son. The young man's jaw was set, his eyes dark with resentment. "You think you're some kind of savior," he said coldly. "You gave her that house just to shame us." The cowboy didn't move. His hat shaded his face, but his voice, calm as a still river, finally broke the silence. "You did that yourself." The words struck deeper than any bullet could. The son's breath caught. He wanted to speak, to argue, but there was nothing left to defend. The cowboy turned to leave, but the man's anger, desperate for release, drove him to draw his gun. The crowd gasped. For a heartbeat, the world froze. The tension stretched thin as wire between them. Then, as the wind shifted, the cowboy's hand never moved. He simply stared, silent and steady. And that silence broke the man completely. The gun fell to the ground. The eldest son collapsed to his knees, his pride finally shattering under the weight of his own guilt. The cowboy said nothing, but his gaze held him there, not with judgment, but with truth. "You don't need a gun to prove you're a man," he said finally, his tone barely above a whisper. "You just need to be willing to change." As the cowboy rode away, the town stood silent. They had seen violence before, too much of it. But what they witnessed that day was rarer, deeper. It was redemption earned not through blood, but through humility. And in the silence that followed, the townsfolk knew they had just seen the kind of strength that could not die with time. The eldest son stayed on his knees long after the cowboy had ridden off. The dust around him settled slowly, and the whispers of the townspeople faded into silence. Shame hung heavy in his chest, thicker than the desert heat. He had spent his life chasing power, mistaking noise for strength, but one man's quiet had just torn down everything he thought he was. For the first time, he saw himself not as a victim of pride, but as its prisoner. He returned to the cabin near dusk, the sun sinking behind the hills like an old wound closing for the night. His mother was outside, hanging laundry, her face peaceful in the fading light. When she saw him approach, her eyes filled with a sadness that carried no anger. She didn't speak, she simply waited. Words, she knew, were useless now. The boy took off his hat, his voice breaking as he said, "I don't deserve to step on this land again, Ma, but I came to make things right." The widow didn't answer immediately. She turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the cowboy's trail disappeared into the open plains. "That man gave you back your chance," she said softly. "Don't waste it by speaking. Prove it." Her voice was gentle, but the truth inside it struck deeper than any scolding could. Her son nodded, tears stinging his eyes. For the first time in years, he understood that forgiveness wasn't given, it was earned. As night fell, the brothers worked side by side repairing the cabin fence, their hands rough but steady. It was the first time they had built something together since their father's death. Each nail driven into it felt like a confession, every strike of the hammer a silent apology. The widow watched from the porch, her heart heavy with pride and sorrow. Redemption, she thought, was not loud. It came in the quiet rhythm of change. And far away, under the same vast sky, the cowboy sat by his campfire, staring into the flames. He didn't know what had happened back at the cabin, but somehow he felt the weight of peace carried on the wind. He had done what he was meant to do. The rest was no longer his burden to carry. Weeks passed, and the cabin that had once been a symbol of loss became a place of rebirth. The widow's garden bloomed again, tended by the same sons who had once abandoned her. The younger sang while he worked, his voice soft and humble. The elder, quieter now, carried a stillness that mirrored the cowboy's, steady, grounded, changed. The townsfolk began to notice the difference. The brothers no longer walked with arrogance, but with purpose, their eyes lowered, their hearts lighter. The story of the silent cowboy spread far beyond the valley. Some said he was a ghost of justice. Others swore he was just a man who had lived too long with sorrow. But the widow knew better. He was proof that kindness does not die, even when buried under years of silence. She often sat on her porch at sunset, her eyes fixed on the horizon, wondering where his path had taken him. She never saw him again, but she didn't need to. His silence had already said all there was to say. One evening, as the sky turned to gold, the widow's eldest son placed the wooden box, the one that once held the key, on the table. Inside, he left something new, a folded note, written in his rough, unsteady hand. It read, "No good deed dies in silence." "I understand that now." The widow smiled through her tears. The lesson that began with one man's quiet act had now been passed on, not by blood, but by grace. The cowboy's legend grew with each telling. Travelers spoke of a man who gave homes to the broken, peace to the restless, and dignity to those the world forgot. But the truth was simpler. He never sought to be a hero. He only sought to do right, even when the world wasn't watching. His silence was not an absence of words. It was the sound of the West itself, vast, unyielding, and full of meaning. And so, the tale of the widow and the quiet cowboy lived on. It wasn't told with thunder or gunfire, but with the hush that follows redemption, a silence that lingers in the wind, reminding every soul that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is to speak through action and let the silence carry their name forever. In the end, The story of the widow and the quiet cowboy became more than a tale whispered across the plains. It became a lesson carried in the hearts of those who heard it. It reminded the people of the West that not all heroes rode with guns drawn or words sharp as steel. Some rode with silence, with kindness, with a will to do what was right even when no one was watching. The cowboy didn't just give her a home. He gave her back the courage to believe in goodness again. His act of quiet redemption spread far beyond that dusty town. The widow found peace not in revenge or wealth, but in forgiveness, the kind that heals without demand. Her children learned that strength was not measured by control or pride, but by the humility to change. And in every sunrise that broke over the valley, the echo of the cowboy's silence lived on, not as an absence, but as a legacy that spoke louder than any voice ever could. Perhaps that is what the West was always trying to teach, that true power is not in what we say, but in what we do when no one is there to praise us. The quiet cowboy rode away without fame, without glory, but his story endured because it carried the truth of what it means to be human, to give, to forgive, and to leave behind something greater than words. His silence was not emptiness. It was grace made visible. And maybe, in your own life, there's a key waiting to be given, a simple act of kindness that could rebuild what was once broken. The cowboy's story is a reminder that redemption doesn't come through noise or anger, but through compassion. Sometimes, the smallest gesture, the one no one sees, can become the miracle that changes everything. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Let your voice carry this message further. Subscribe to the channel for more tales that move the heart and honor the spirit of the Old West. And if you believe that silent kindness still has the power to change lives, leave a like, because even in silence, good deeds deserve to be heard.